This episode is sponsored by Be Water Smart, bewatersmart.info. Drought and water conservation is a way of life in the West, but saving water should always be a good garden practice wherever you live. Be Water Smart is making it their goal to help gardeners, homeowners, and residents do their part with helpful tips, videos, and links. You will find tips on irrigation, such as when you should water, which type of drip or sprinklers are best, and even a very helpful video on how to convert standard sprinklers to drip. Plus, what I always preach about, mulching. Remember, no pixie dust. And you'll even find a video of me talking about it. And of course, you've heard me say over and over again, check your soil moisture before you water. Why waste water when not necessary? Be Water Smart has helpful tips so you know you are watering efficiently and correctly. This includes how to water trees and even save 30% more on lawn irrigation. Plus, they have a database of 1,800 low water use plants. Yes, 1,800 plants. Plus, garden tours and pictures to help you design and plant your water-wise landscaping. And since watering smart saves not only our precious resource, but helps you save money, they have links for rebates and services. So stay current on Be Water Smart news by signing up so you don't miss important info. That's bewatersmart.info.
Look at that plant. I want you to know that everything was grown in my garden. Don't touch that plant!
Is it poisonous?
She'll become part of the plant.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Flower Power Garden Hour. I am your host, Marlene, and tonight we are going to talk orchids. It's cooling down. Many of you have your winter gardens planted, or you're not doing winter garden. A lot of your garden chores are done, and you're thinking about being inside, and you want some greenery. And of course, everyone loves orchids. A lot of people are confused about orchids. You get an orchid as a gift. You find one fairly cheap at the store. You get it. It blooms. But what next? So with me is Shawn Shumaker. Oh, boy. I can't say your name. Shawn Shumaker. Well, that's a tongue twister. I didn't realize.
Say that 5 times fast.
I know. I don't want to. Don't make me. You are a student worker at the conservatory, and we hired you pretty much right away, right? As soon as we found out that you were...
Yeah, I was emailing Ernesto about renting some greenhouse space when I moved up, and then he just randomly was like, "Hey, do you want a job?"
Yeah.
Okay, sure.
Well, we jump on when we find experts in something that we're not. I remember it. And we were like, "Oh, he wants to rent space. What does he have? And I was hesitant. And then, he's worked down in these greenhouses and everything, and oh, yeah, we need them because we have our last orchid expert left, as you could tell from our collection, many years ago.
Yeah.
And it's just sort of been, we've lost some.
They're there and they're
there.
Existing.
They're existing, yes. So then you came along and we're like, this is great. I mean, you're also a carnivore expert as well.
Yes.
So you're helping with both. But I've been forcing you sort of more into, I'm like, hey, look at this orchid over here. Why don't you do something about this one?
Full disclosure, I mean, carnivores are my babies. I do love my carnivores, but orchids are pretty all right too.
Yeah, that's what just so you know, that's what this topic is. Yeah. I hope you didn't come in here and you're just going to slide the carnivores in. I mean, I will say it's time to do another carnivore episode, but we'll wait on that. Okay. So we'll do orchids now. But interesting backstory. I always like to get backstory about, people that you grew up in or lived at least for a bit in the Mojave Desert.
Yes, I was born in Lancaster, which is I guess that's the biggest city in the area, but I wouldn't even call it a big city. And then I lived in the town of Mojave, which is this little teeny tiny town. Mm-hmm. And I didn't even live in the proper town. I lived kind of in the outskirts of it in this little teeny town. I mean, there was 30 people in the neighborhood, and that was probably it. And I moved out to... I lived in the high desert, and then I moved out to the Ventura, Santa Barbara area when I was in middle school. But my whole childhood was out in the middle of the desert. And when I say in the middle of the desert, I mean in the middle of the desert.
In the middle of the desert.
We had several acres, and I would get on my dirt bike and just go into the desert and just disappear and look for snakes and
Joe literally is salivating right now because I think that's his dream. And then today you told me, because someone was mentioning what reptiles they had. You're like, oh yeah, one time I had how many tarantulas? You should just go outside and find them.
Yeah, actually, I didn't have too many tarantulas when I lived in Mojave. I got into invertebrates when I was a little bit older.
As one does.
Yeah, obviously. At one point I had, let's see, probably 25 snakes, 30 plus frogs, 50 some tarantulas, 50 some scorpions, assorted centipedes and other arthropods I thought were interesting.
Oh, I didn't know people actually kept centipedes as a pet.
Yeah.
Those okay.
They're interesting. They're kind of, not a lot of things actually scare me. I wouldn't say they scare me, but they're pretty, like, I'm on my toes when I'm working with those big centipedes because they're fast and the bites aren't fun.
Yeah. What kind of snakes did you find out? I mean, in
Mojave?
Yeah.
There was tons of gopher snakes.
Okay.
King snakes every once in a while. Long-nosed snakes. Rattlesnakes, kind of.
But not tons?
Not tons. There was 2 species out there that I saw regularly. There was the Mojave rattlesnake and then the Western Diamondback rattlesnake.
Got it. Okay.
But they definitely weren't as common as like gopher snakes.
Yeah. Okay. I was just wondering if there was any. I haven't heard of the long nose.
Long nose snake.
Did it really have a long? How can you tell? How can you tell if a snake has a long nose?
Elongated. I mean, I wouldn't say it doesn't go out like inches in front of its face.
It's not Pinocchio.
Yeah.
It's Pinocchio snake. Oh, okay. That's interesting. And then you moved to Santa Barbara, Ventura. So you went from dry, hot to really nice coast.
The best climate in the world. I maintain, yeah.
I don't think there's many people who would actually fault you for saying that. And is that when you started working with orchids, or?
So I moved up in middle school, and then I was growing carnivores at the time and was really big into the carnivores. And then I was taking classes, this was several years later, taking classes at Santa Barbara City College, and one of my classes got canceled. And I remember going to this weird kind of obscure orchid nursery that was kind of out towards UCSB, but it's in the middle of a residential area. It's kind of in a really awkward place for an orchid nursery, but it's a huge facility. And a friend had taken me there several years before I was taking those classes. Anyways, one of the classes was canceled, and I had another night class, so I had a couple hours to kill. So I was like, "Oh, I'll go check out that orchid nursery." And I drove over there, wandered around for a bit, talked with the manager and with the owner, who's been there for. I mean, he started working there when it first opened in 1957.
Wow!
And then he took over when the previous owner passed away.
Okay.
And then he left it to his kids, and they're running it now, but he's still there all the time. And so I talked to him, and we talked for a couple hours, and I think I ended up missing that class that I was actually killing time for because we were talking so much. And then I was about to leave, and the manager came up and asked if I wanted a job, and I was like, okay. I had a couple of orchids. I was growing a few Paphiopedilums, but I wasn't super into them. But I was like, oh, it's an amazing place, and it seems like a fun place to work. So I said yes, and the rest is history.
So Santa Barbara's actually, you could do like an orchid, like they have orchid. Was it the Orchid Trail or something? Because they have so many greenhouses down there.
Santa Barbara Orchid Estate is where I was working, and literally right across the road was another massive orchid nursery, which was Cal Orchid. And then Gallup and Stribling is another big place that's right down the road in Carpinteria.
Yeah. And
then Westerly Orchids. So if you bought a Phalaenopsis at a garden center anywhere in California, it probably came from Westerly.
Wow. So what kind of orchids did you, do they have a lot of diversity?
Yeah, that's the thing that I thought was most incredible about SBOE was the sheer diversity. I mean, there was probably 1,000 different species, and
whoa, that's a good amount.
As many as that, plus more hybrids.
Okay,
and we did breeding there, and yeah, just the sheer diversity was staggering. It wasn't just a tissue culture one thing and propagated a million times. We had flats of thousands of plants,
and that's how you learn. I mean, just being immersed in so many different types,
right?
And people think, oh, orchids.
most people are familiar, like the ones you mentioned, the Phalaenopsis. You go into a grocery store and that's what you see. One, because they actually are one of the orchids that do well-ish inside. And so a lot of people think, oh, that they're all grown the same. But orchids are found, all over the world.
They're found in every continent except for Antarctica.
Mhm.
Almost every habitat type you can imagine. There's succulent orchids that are native to like the Arabian Peninsula. There's orchids that are native to the United States, that are native to California, rainforests, deserts.
Yeah.
You name it, there's probably an orchid that's adapted to live there.
Terrestrial orchids, epiphytic orchids, bog orchids. It runs the whole. So when you say, oh, I like orchids, I want to grow orchids, you have to really do your homework.
Right.
And of course, a lot of these you're not going to be able to find just at any nursery, usually online or going to a specialty. But we got to start talking with the Phalaenopsis. We just have to, because mainly because I get so many questions about it. I'm sure you got so many questions. Tons. Yeah. So people I just bought a Phalaenopsis. What do I do with it? It's funny because a lot of times, and I'm sure you got this, as soon as it was done flowering, people thought it was dead.
Oh, yeah. They didn't realize that it was still alive and a living plant that flowers multiple times and grows.
Like it's still green. Yeah. It's just because it lost its flower. Or just a couple of weeks ago, I got one where there was no leaves. It was just dead. And someone's like, what can I do for this? I'm like, oh, they're so optimistic. I mean, broke my heart because, I was like, oh, well.
I hate to be the bearer of bad news.
Yeah, exactly. So, all right, go through the steps. If someone gets a Phalaenopsis, where should they put it? How should they water? And I know these questions are so difficult because you got, what's your sun exposure? Do you run your heater? Do you run your air? Your type of water? But go through the basics of when someone gets a Phalaenopsis, what should they do? Go through the steps.
So the most important things I would say are light and your water. Those are the two most important things. If you're keeping it in your house, temperature is usually not an issue unless you have it in some like garage or something that gets exposed to high or low temperatures, but temperature is usually not an issue inside. Phalaenopsis prefer a bit less light than other orchids and even other plants, so just ambient kind of room lighting is usually enough. If you have a window, I would put it not directly in the window because a lot of times they can burn for even just from that much light. But if you have a table that's kind of next to a window, that's usually a good place for it. They'll let you know pretty quickly if they're getting too much light. The leaves will start to kind of curl up and you'll get sunburn on it. And then watering is another big thing. People tend to overwater them, I've noticed. It's two extremes. You either kill it with kindness and overwater it, or you forget that it exists and you don't water it for 6 months.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, the symptoms of overwatering and underwatering can be pretty similar.
Yeah.
So with underwatering, you'll notice the leaves starting to kind of desiccate and curl up and turn brown. And that's just because there's no water and the cells are dying. And then with overwatering, the leaves can start to get, in the first stages, the leaves will start to get a bit of discoloration.
Mm-hmm.
And then as it progresses, the roots will start to rot away. And then when the roots rot away, the plant can't get water into its system again. And then it starts to show signs of underwatering. The leaves desiccate, which is kind of ironic.
I know, exactly. I always tell people, you're basically overwatering it so it's not getting water.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's pretty much it.
That's what it's about.
It's really hard to tell. And I always tell people, when in doubt, if you think you're overwatering it, you probably are.
Yeah.
I mean,
so they like a fair amount of water, but they're epiphytes in nature, so they're growing on a tree, and they get water kind of in waves. So when it rains, that's when they get their water, but they don't have the luxury of being surrounded by soil like other plants that will retain a bit of moisture. So once the rain stops, they stop getting water. So they're adapted to less water than you would think from being in such a rainy forest.
And when you get them, a lot of them, you pull them out of, the ceramic pot, and they're in that plastic sleeve, and they're wrapped really tight with sphagnum.
Yeah.
And sphagnum holds on to a lot of moisture. So that in itself, if you're growing it in that for the time being, you don't need to water as much as you would think.
Exactly.
Do you recommend that people keep it in sphagnum or get it out of that? Because most people overwater.
Right. So if you're really experienced with growing orchids, I think sphagnum can be a good media. If you're not experienced with orchids, sphagnum is probably the worst thing you can keep it in. It holds too much water, and then when it does dry out, it's really hard to rehydrate.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just on both ends, it's the wrong thing to keep it in. My favorite media for Phalaenopsis is a nice, high quality, coarse orchid bark. And then a lot of times they'll throw in a little bit of perlite just for a little bit of extra drainage. So
I was going to say, so high quality doesn't mean most of the junk that's at nurseries.
yeah, there's very few brands that are actually decent, and the rest is pretty garbage.
Yeah.
You can use the lower quality stuff in the short term, but you're gonna have to repot more often because it's just
Okay.
gonna break down
Mhm.
super fast. Yeah.
So you're just going to, it breaks down and
It breaks
that's
down,
it. And then you
yeah.
have soil and then you just are basically in an environment that it's not happy with.
Exactly. It the water gets trapped on the roots and then they rot, and then you're in that
Yeah.
overwatering predicament.
So, okay, I have to bring this up. I talked about it briefly, and I still get questions, and people still, the ice cube method. Yeah, I know.
It's so painful every time I hear it.
And the painful thing is, this was a marketing ploy by Orchids.
Yeah.
It was, I could just see some marketing firm came up with this, and the Orchid, or I don't know, the distributor was like, yeah, let's go with this.
Let's go with that.
Let's go with
Yeah.
it. And it's stuck.
I tell people that orchids are plants and not cocktails, so you shouldn't put ice cubes on them.
I like that. I mean, there's multiple reasons why you don't want to put an ice cube on it.
It's not the most efficient way of watering. It's not how the plants want to uptake the water. It's cold. I mean, these are tropical
cold.
plants, and the roots are sensitive. The meristem that it's close by is sensitive. It's just, I want to meet the person who thought that was a good idea and give them a stern talking to.
There you go. I want to kick him in the butt.
Yeah.
I mean, if you want to talk to them,
A
that's
stern
fine.
talking to is
Yeah.
not my
Yeah,
first
yeah.
thought, but
Well, I think people are so scared of knowing how much to water. So when you're told, put 2 ice cubes
Yeah.
on, it takes all the thought and the worry away.
right.
So I understand that. And when you're told, when you get an orchid, this is how you do it, of course you think
I'm not
that's-
faulting the people who
No,
follow that
yeah, you
advice.
are.
Yeah.
You told me you are. No, just kidding.
You're the worst.
So, yes, that's why I get why it sticks and people do it, because it is hard to just figure out how much. So when someone is watering, what are good, like what's a good baseline? How should they know they're watering, and what technique they should water?
So a rule of thumb that I tell people is in the summer, when it's warmer, you want to water once a week. And in the winter, you want to water once every week and a half to 2 weeks.
Okay.
This is very general, and the
Mhm.
plant will tell you if it's getting enough water or if it wants more water.
And they're more forgiving underwater, like a lot of plants,
Right.
too. So always err on the side of probably not as much. And if it's in bark, do you recommend that people submerge it or still pour over it?
I like to get a watering container,
Mhm.
hold the pot over the sink, run some water through it, set it back in its wherever you're keeping it, and then come back an hour later and do the same thing.
Okay.
Just so
An hour later. Okay.
yeah.
Got it.
Let all the water run through and give it time to kind of soak up a little bit, and then do it again.
Yeah.
And that's a good way to ensure that the roots are getting enough water and taking it up.
Yeah. And I imagine you don't use Davis tap water on your.
So I get into arguments with people about this all the
Oh,
time
oh,
because
ooh.
some people maintain that tap water is perfectly acceptable for orchids,
Mhm.
and I maintain that in the short term it's okay, but over time you're going to run into problems, especially with tap water like Davis, which
Yeah.
is absolutely atrocious.
It's
and there's
atrocious.
so much stuff dissolved into it.
Yeah.
You're going to get salts building up in the media, and it's going to cause the media to break down even faster, and it's just all around not good.
Yeah. So if you have decent to good tap water, you may get away with it for a bit.
Right.
But you might as well just use bottled or rainwater.
I prefer rainwater works. I like reverse osmosis or
Mhm.
distilled
Yeah.
water. That
Okay.
might be the carnivore bias coming out, but
Yeah.
Phalaenopsis are a little bit less sensitive to water quality than others, but if you're going to start venturing into the more kind of finicky pleurothalids or paphiopedilums, you're going to want to use high quality water.
He's dropping the names
Ooh.
now.
Here it comes.
Yeah, apparently orchid growers like to name them peas too. Pleurothalids.
Oh, there's so many.
I know. Okay, so a big question is, when do you know to transplant? And when you have aerial roots, do you need to get them all in the pot? What happens if you break one? What happens when you transplant it and it's mushy? Do you cut those off?
So the determining factor with repotting orchids is usually not the pot, it's the media.
Oh,
When the media starts to break down, that's when you want to repot.
Okay.
Orchids in general like to be kind of root bound and kind of pot bound, so they like a smaller pot than you would think
Mhm.
that plant would want. As far as transplanting goes, take the plant out of the pot.
Mhm.
Make sure to kind of wipe away or wash away all of the old media. Inspect the roots. Keep roots that look kind of healthy and
Firm.
firm, have
Mhm.
green tips. If you see any roots that are obviously rotted or brown, cut those away and then put the plant back into a pot and then put fresh media around it. I like to leave a couple of aerial roots sticking out of the pot. I don't shove everything back into it.
Sometimes it's impossible to.
Yeah,
I mean,
sometimes it just won't fit.
It won't fit, and
Right.
you don't want to break them by bending them in there. So I
Mhm.
tell people it's okay to leave some
You
their
can-
aerial roots in the
Yeah,
wild, even though
yeah.
it's more humidity in the wild than your house, but still.
Mhm.
So it's okay to leave some.
It's
out.
definitely okay to
Okay.
leave some out.
All right.
Yeah.
That's good. But yeah, they do don't put it in too big of a pot, because then you have so much media that stays wet and the
Mhm.
plant can't.
And the plant can't
Yeah.
handle it.
So getting back to the flower, so if you leave a Phalaenopsis flower spike and it's done and you leave it, it could start resprouting.
It can rebloom from that same inflorescence. Yeah.
But that's always not the best thing, or is that okay? You won't get a full bloom.
You won't get a full bloom. I usually leave them on there just because. And if the plant is well hydrated and well fertilized, there's no issues, and it'll rebloom kind of fully. The Phalaenopsis orchids that are found in the grocery stores, the
Mhm.
ones that people typically get, are kind of crazy, convoluted, man-made hybrids that kind of bloom outside of the usual sequence of the species that you would find in nature. I mean, in nature, they're not going to be blooming for 3 or 4 months straight.
Yeah.
So.
But that's what's so nice about them. Yeah.
That's why we bred them. We
Yeah,
bred them for,
exactly.
beautiful, large flowers that last a long
time.
Yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned a big key word, fertilizing. You go to the fertilizer aisle and it's almost like cannabis, where it's like, give it to this, then give it to this, then give it this. And, I think people get confused in one. They're like, okay, my Phalaenopsis was $10. These 2 different fertilizers are like 20
Right.
each. And I don't need this much. So when should people fertilize, with what? And do we really need to do? Is that the best to give them 2 different types?
I stress that fertilizing is not as important as a lot of people make it out to be. It is important, and over time, if you don't fertilize, the plant will suffer. But it's not the end of the world if you go a month or 2 without fertilizing. And I stress that it's much safer to under fertilize than to over fertilize. It's really easy to overdo it and burn your plants. You can go to most hardware stores and get the water soluble orchid fertilizer, and that works just fine. If you are insistent on fertilizing really regularly, I like to suggest what's called the weekly. So you fertilize once a week at a really weak diluted solution. So if the label says fertilize at 1 teaspoon per gallon, do 1/4 of a teaspoon per gallon.
Okay.
and then do that like once a week or
okay.
once every 2 weeks.
All right. Do you like the Maxi?
I love Maxi.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. We could drop name brands here.
Yeah.
It's okay. Yeah, not that they're sponsoring us, but yeah, Maxi.
Hit me up, Maxi.
Yeah, I know. You were using it on your carnivores today.
Oh, yeah.
I know.
It's
one
of
note
the few
to self:
things.
only know what only fertilize your carnivores if you know what you're doing. That's just
That's true.
disclaimer there.
Yeah.
So Maxi is a good one. That's
Maxi's a good one. What's that brand? Grow More?
Grow More.
I think
And we use Grow More for in our fert tanks.
Yeah.
So,
I think that's
okay.
there's a I think it's a 20 urea free
Okay.
kind of general use one is the one that I like to go to.
And that's okay to use consistently, or do you up it or decrease?
I use that consistently.
Yeah, okay.
You can they make special like bloom
Yeah.
formulas with
Mhm.
higher was it phosphorus
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
mess around with
Okay.
that. Just use a general like 16 16 16 or 20 20 20.
Okay. Got it.
Follow the instructions. If
And-
anything, dilute it more than the instructions say because it's just err on the side of caution.
God, I think that's a big thing is, it's like, oh, well, now it's not in bloom. Now I need to give it a bloom fertilizer, but just straight across.
Straight across.
Yeah.
Giving it a bloom fertilizer isn't going to induce the blooming.
Mhm.
That comes from temperature cues. So but spraying something that says bloom formula on it isn't going to
I
do
know.
anything.
I know. People want their dang blooms right there, and that fertilizer says it's
Why aren't
supposed
you
to.
perpetually
I know.
blooming?
I mean, this just makes me realize how much misinformation there is in that.
Oh yeah.
I mean, with any industry, but really, it's all marketing.
Oh yeah.
So So, and then light, of course. And when you say window, it's, south, not right up against the glass, east. But then again, some people are like, well, I had it in a south window. Well, you had a giant shade tree outside and you never opened your blind. So
Yeah.
trust me, there are,
There's a million different variables.
There's so
and-
many variables. That's why it's so hard. But, light, and like you said, don't err on the side of underwatering it.
Mhm.
So let's get into some fun
Okay.
orchids. But we'll ease into the super fun. But we'll talk about what are other orchids that people could grow inside their house besides Phalaenopsis that people should try to sort of try inside their house.
If you've mastered the Phalaenopsis and you feel confident in moving on, there's a few that I would recommend when I was working at the orchid nursery. Hybrid Paphiopedilums, the slipper orchids, are a good one to try. Miltonias are a good one to try, and Oncidium, the kind of like Sherry Baby group, is another good one to try because Sherry Baby refers to like several different cultivars.
Is that right?
Yeah.
There's not just one Sherry Baby?
I think there should be one Sherry Baby, but
now it's all.
there's Sherry Baby such and such and Sherry Baby such and such.
How
and
messed up is the orchid naming world?
It gets pretty convoluted.
Yeah.
So the Royal Botanical Garden at Kew does a good job. I think they're the ones that manage all of the cultivar names and everything.
okay.
They do a good job of keeping, there's the proper nomenclature and there's the conventions you have to follow. It gets bad when plants change names. So like some taxonomists will come along and move plants from one group to another, and it just turns into a massive nightmare.
There's just so many hybrids of orchids.
Yeah.
So many.
So orchids are the largest angiosperm family, the largest group of flowering plants. There's 28,000 some odd species. It's probably getting closer to 30,000 now. And then there's at least 100,000 man-made hybrids.
Oh my
Probably
God.
more than that.
It's crazy.
The diversity is staggering.
Yeah. And unfortunately, I mean, to most people and even experts I know, when they're not in bloom, you can't really tell.
A lot of them look really similar.
Yeah, you
I'm
could
just
narrow
like,
down maybe the genus,
like,
but
ooh,
you're like,
that's a cat land.
yeah,
that's
that's
about
it. It's all in the flowers. It's all about the flowers, people.
Any number of 10,000 sympodial orchid species.
Yeah, and I'm just gonna say it. When they're not in bloom, most of them are not attractive.
That's like,
you could
that's
say
a
it.
that's a green plant.
Yeah, that's a
definitely a plant.
green
Yeah,
plant. I mean,
cool.
obviously there's some out there, like the jewel orchids. Okay, so the Miltonia is also what, the pansy? Is that called the pansy?
I think they call it the pansy.
Because that's a very
orchid.
open face.
Right.
And that, I imagine, is similar to like a Phalaenopsis Phalaenopsis growth. I actually find it easier to grow.
I think
than
they're easier to grow. They like a little bit more light, and they're a bit more forgiving with the temperatures.
I think so too. And the foliage is more. So I don't know. To me, it's just easier to grow.
Yeah. Also, another issue with Phalaenopsis is they have a very finite amount of leaves. So they have usually 2 or 3 leaves. So if something goes wrong with the leaves, the whole plant tends to collapse just because there's not enough photosynthetic material to support it. Whereas other orchids, you can lose a couple of leaves and it's not the end of the world. Or they have pseudobulbs to draw reserves from. Whereas Phalaenopsis are vivacious orchids and they don't have a pseudobulb.
They don't. Yeah. And so when we're talking about pseudobulb, it's that swollen area at the base of the leaf, and it's not really a bulb, thus pseudo, but it is a starch and energy reserve.
Right.
And you never want to cut that off unless that's brown.
Yeah.
Because that's still green. It photosynthesizes and it's storing stuff. And then you mentioned the Paphiopedilums, the lady slippers. And so really the hybrids, not the species ones.
Yeah, there's some species that are a bit more forgiving than others, but in general, the hybrids, you get that hybrid vigor and they're pretty forgiving. They have fairly similar cultural requirements to Phalaenopsis as far as lighting and temperature goes. The one caveat with paths is they like a little bit more water than the Phalaenopsis do. So where I would grow a Phalaenopsis in coarse bark, I would grow a path in kind of a finer bark that holds water for a little bit longer.
Okay. And would you ever suggest maybe mixing a little sphagnum in with the bark? Or is that, you said perlite with some bark, but you don't like mixing sphagnum
I don't like
in?
mixing sphagnum in even with paths. It's,
Okay. You run the risk of
it's
overwatering.
really easy to overwater them, and then rot starts and plants die and bad things happen.
Yeah. So far, no sphagnum on any of these. None. And you'd mentioned earlier, okay, so wait a minute, Miltonias and then the Sherry babies, which is on Oncidium. And that's very similar to Phalaenopsis growing.
All these have fairly similar cultural requirements. So it's just if you want a bit of diversity or spice in your life.
Yeah, woo, yeah. Look at, I forgot Valentine's Day, and I'm bringing home not a Phalaenopsis or a rose from the drugstore. I'm bringing home a Sherry baby.
A Sherry baby. And they smell amazing
They do.
too. Yeah.
They really do, actually. They're one of the best smelling orchids. Because some are very fragrant, others not so much.
There's some that smell amazing and some that are pretty repulsive.
Oh, like the bulbophyllums.
There's bulbophyllum Phalaenopsis can smell pretty awful.
Yeah, they're bulbophyllum. A lot of bulbophyllums are fly
pollinated, so they smell awful. There's Dendrobium. Is it Cucumbrianum?
Oh,
it's this kind of obscure little dendrobium, and it gets these kind of. The flowers aren't much to look at. They're kind of interesting.
Okay.
Little pale flowers. I would always have people who came into the nursery. I'd be like, "Oh, go smell that," and then they'd be like, "Ooh," because all orchids smell good, right?
All flowers smell good. Yeah.
They'd stick their nose in it, and I compare it to, so if you go to the gym and you work out and you sweat a bunch, and then you take your socks off and you throw them on the ground and leave them there for a couple of days, and then smell it. That's about what it smells like. Just kind of musty,
great
sweat.
Yeah. So what that is, I imagine, also fly pollinated. Or what would that be pollinated by?
I believe that's fly pollinated.
Yeah.
I'm not entirly certain on that
Yeah,
one.
something that likes disgusting things. So a male of any sort. Sorry. This is not a male bashing podcast, but when it just, you throw me one, what am I going to do with that?
Fair enough.
So what orchids are your favorite? Or ones that you want to grow more of in the collection, or ones that you just find,
So I'm pretty partial to Paphiopedilums, the slipper orchids.
Okay.
Those were the first ones that I grew, and the flowers kind of vaguely resemble a pitcher plant. They look kind of carnivorous.
Yeah.
Which is what intrigued me in the first place.
I forgot. All has to come back to the carnivores.
Everything comes back to carnivores in the end. So those will always have a special place in my heart. I'm fond of pleurothalids, so the kind of Central and Southern American dainty little Masdevallias, Draculas, Pleurothallis, those guys.
I will say with the Pleurothallis, and people, they could Google any of these. We have a really I think chartreuse pink one blooming.
Mhm.
That one I like, but the orange, the flowers themselves, I don't find that thrilling. For the most part, I see. Oh my god, I'm getting daggers. And same with Masdevallia. It has to be a phenomenal, but then I'll see a phenomenal one and I really like it. But in general, they're not my favorite.
I think some of them are an acquired taste. You have to be kind of a crazy,
Orchid.
nerdy or orchid person
Okay.
to appreciate them. There's some that are, I mean, I'll give you credit. There's some that are kind of boring.
Yeah, some that are boring.
Yeah.
They're cool growers though.
Cool. Yeah.
So
they
most
tend
of
to
the
be cool growers.
people really can't grow these inside their house. That would
Yeah.
be almost impossible,
Mhm.
right?
You need kind of specialized grow chambers.
Yeah. Are they because they're in the more of the cloud forest?
A lot of them are from cloud forest,
Okay.
where it's just perpetually shrouded in clouds, so it's always humid and it's
Yeah.
always kind of chilly. I don't want to say cold, but
It's not cold,
chilly.
but it's
50s, 60s.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, to me, that's cold. But I actually want to go back to your Paphiopedilums, and I want to talk about their pollination a bit. How you're like, oh, they're similar to carnivores, but they're not.
Yeah.
So
it's all just a fancy that shape of the flower is just a fancy way of getting pollinators to the reproductive bits. It just channels insects.
yeah,
They land on that kind of
lip.
and then go behind into the flower.
Yeah.
And that's where the stamen are. And then the stigma is right below the stamen.
It's so difficult because we use this as an example in one of our groups, but we have a hybrid. So it's like, oh, the center there, that yellow dot right there looks like an aphid. Well, then you look at all the hybrids, and you're like, really doesn't. So we're trying to show students, right? Because we have the hybrid ones, I think. So yeah, they'll go to it thinking it's an aphid, and they think they're going to lay larvae, and they fall into the pouch, which is where it sort of looks carnivorous. And of course, they get wet, and then the hairs are a ladder behind it. And it's interesting because, I mean, I'm letting people know, you know this already, that orchids don't have loose pollen. They're in little pollinia. They're a little sacs, so then get stuck. And man, that is sticky. It's very sticky.
The path flowers are unique because their layout is a little bit different. So a lot of orchids will have two pollinia, but they're very close together. And path pollinia are kind of on either side of the, I guess that's the column. And it's very, very sticky. Like some orchids have relatively sticky pollen, but then they have a little kind of appendage that attaches to the pollen that kind of sticks to the insects. And then the path pollen is just the whole mass, the whole pollinia is just gooey. And
really?
sticky.
So the pollinia itself is sticky.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Yeah, because a lot of it will just be this little, like you said, appendage that sticks. And then it's just hanging out there. Like, hey. Oh, okay. I need to go. I need to go and examine. Yeah. But I never want to open the flowers. They don't flower tons for us. As you know, our collection is not the best. We need to up that.
There's some, I forget the name of the hybrid, but it has probably like 10 flowers on it right now.
Okay. So I saw it somewhere blooming.
We can sacrifice
I like the Rothschildiana.
Rothschildiana.
That's the one with the long curls, right? I do like that one.
That grows on Mount Kinabalu with a bunch of Phalaenopsis species. So I'm partial to that one.
Okay. Because it's growing with the Nepenthes. Okay. Okay, so you like the Pleurophthalus, Masdevallia, but we know that they're...
My absolute favorite orchids are angraecoids.
Okay.
So they're this, I think the one that most people are familiar with is Angraecum sesquipedale, so Charles Darwin's orchid. Big, pale, off-white, greenish flowers with a amazing, gorgeous, color. Staggering. Huge flowers relative to the size of the plant, and then with a massive nectar spur.
You got to tell the whole story.
I got to tell the whole story. Okay, so when Charles Darwin was kind of working on his theory of evolution, him and Alfred Russel Wallace, I can't forget him. People forget about poor Wallace. But they were kind of working on it concurrently, and they were both sent specimens of this amazing orchid from Madagascar. And Darwin saw the long nectar spur at the base of the flower, and he was like, I bet there was some insect, and he thought it was a moth because it was white and he assumed it was night pollinated, that evolved with this plant and has a huge proboscis that can reach that. and its head will fit into
Mhm.
the flower. And everyone thought he was crazy. Like, there's no way there's an insect
Yeah.
with a proboscis that's like 18 inches
Yeah.
long. And then a couple years, I think it was like 10 or 12 years after he passed away, they went back to Madagascar and they found that hawk moth with that long proboscis. And they named it, I think it's Xenophis morganii predictii, as like an homage to his prediction. And I think that's the hallmark of an amazing like scientific theory, is that you can use it to make predictions like that. And it just shows what an amazing scientist Darwin actually was. I could go on about Darwin all day, I'm sorry.
I guess so.
I'm
I
kind of a
guess so.
fanboy.
Wow. You're like, I've been for him for Halloween and no one knows who it was. No, but I mean, it is really pretty amazing because you see this nectar spur that like you said, is like 18 inches, and you're like, what could actually pollinate
Mhm.
that? And sure enough, it
Yeah.
is a giant moth, and we have species of that.
Right.
By the way, you need to repot that for us.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that plant has seen better days. It kind of crushes me every time I see it.
We won't mention what happened to
Yeah.
it. We won't. Yeah, it was donated to us, and okay, well, we'll work on that. But it was blooming, and it is. I mean, it's a beautiful structural flower. People who know me know I'm into gaudy hybrid orchids. The more gaudy colors and the number of colors and the size in an orchid, I'm way more into it.
It was a running joke at the Orchid Estate where I would be dividing plants and they would come in and be like, "Hey, Shawn, guess what? Another gaudy cattleya for you to divide
Yes.
your favorite."
Yes.
Wink, wink.
Yes. So it's what is it? Brassica, Laelia, Cattleya.
Brassiolate, yeah, BLC.
BLC short, and those are hybrids of the Cattleya, Laelia, and the
Brassivola.
Brassivola. And still, are they still? Did they get rid of that? They didn't get rid of that genus, did they?
Brassivola still exists. A lot of them turn into BC or BL because the Cattleya or the Laelia parent
Okay,
got put into either
that's what.
Cattleya
Yeah,
or Laelia, like it switched. So
yeah. But I'll just still call them BCLs, and those are the hybrids, which is crazy because that's the parentage. But you get these big. That's where you get the big multicolored,
showy, like corsage flowers.
and they're usually fragrant.
Mhm.
Yeah, I love them because like the species orchids tend to be more demure and solid colors, and it's
Yeah,
fine.
you can get tetraploids that have big showy flowers, but
Okay. What is the what is the holy grail of orchids these days? I mean, wasn't like the ghost orchid for a while?
yeah, I still think that's pretty high up there in
Okay.
remarkable
Okay.
species.
Yeah.
Dendrophallix lindanii is the like Florida ghost orchid.
Okay.
Has it's a completely leafless orchid, grows on the side of cypress trees. Can't remember what trees it grows on, but down in the south, you can't really notice it most of the time. It just looks kind of like little
Roots.
roots.
Yeah.
I mean, not
Yeah.
even vines. There's not really any chlorophyll in them. But then a couple, like once a year, you get these amazing flower, like massive white flowers kind of projecting off of it. It looks like a little ghost floating by the side of the tree. And
That's how it gets its
yeah.
name. Yeah. And I mean, for people, there is such a thing as leafless orchids. Literally, there's a tiny, tiny, tiny stem because you have to have a stem,
Mhm.
and then you have all these aerial roots, and the roots are acting like leaves. They could photosynthesize, they could actually absorb moisture, and then they
Mhm.
get nutrients that way, and so you don't really need leaves per
Yeah.
se. So just so people know, in case they're like, "What? There's no leaves on it." So what else we're growing some of the terrestrial orchids, right?
Yeah, we're growing. So a coworker of mine, Ian, brought in a bunch of Ophrys orchids, which are the bee mimic orchids
Yeah.
from Europe, and the flowers resemble the like abdomen of female bees or wasps.
Mm-hmm.
And the male bees see that and they're like, "Ooh, hubba hubba,
Yeah.
let's go." And they go over and they try to mate with the flower and end up getting the pollen on their body. And then insects aren't
Right.
terribly clever.
Yeah.
So they leave that flower kind of disappointed and they see the next flower and they're like, "Ooh, hubba hubba, maybe this will work out." And then pollinate that flower and
Yeah.
go
We
from flower to flower.
we have the
Trichoceras.
Trichoceras,
Yeah.
and that one is the one we've had for a while that does mimicry.
hmm
It looks like a little wasp, I guess.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many different wasps and species of
That's
it.
a
but to me-
So the Ophrys are a terrestrial species, and the Trichoceras is an epiphytic species
Mhm.
from South America.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but it's the same kind of
same mimicry
mechanism,
type
yeah.
thing. And so we're growing the terrestrial ones outside in pots. What's the substrate?
I think they're just in like kind of a really well drained succulent
Yeah.
mix. So it's like pumice and perlite and
Which is
some.
crazy, which you wouldn't think orchids, but
Yeah.
terrestrial, they're in
Mhm.
the ground.
hmm
And so
Actually, they do really well in Davis. It kind of mimics that like Mediterranean climate, so it's kind of warm, dry summers and mild, wet winters.
yeah, because I think they're going to go dormant in the summer.
Yeah, they're just waking up right
They're
now.
just coming out of dormancy, so they go completely dormant. We didn't kill them, and then they get water now, and then in the summer you just cut off the water, and
Mhm.
so it's. I mean, it's interesting. That's the thing. It's totally different than orchids that we're growing inside the greenhouse.
Yeah.
Where you have these tropical epiphytic. Now we're going to terrestrial European.
Mhm.
I mean, that's
That's
crazy.
that's the thing that's staggering about orchids, just the sheer diversity and the sheer amount of ways that they've evolved to occupy pretty much every niche.
So you talked about tissue culture. Do you see another orchid being in the market tissue cultured as much as Phalaenopsis? That is gonna. I mean, it's really because that one's just so easy. Easier. I'm not gonna say so easy to grow. It's the easier one to grow. But I mean, out of so many, you think we would have more to choose from for inside the house?
They might be working on something.
Yeah.
I honestly, I've kind of stayed away from that. I like all the weird little obscure
I
things
know.
that you can't grow on your windowsill.
Yeah.
So
Okay. All right. So let's talk about pests
okay,
because you're going to get pests.
yeah.
Yeah. And some people who are collecting, as soon as they see some pests, i.e. like mealybugs, they'll throw the plant out if it's
Mhm.
nothing rare, just so they don't get it to spread. But what if someone does have, first of all, what are the major pests of
So scale is probably the worst one. Mealybugs pretty bad. Aphids are pretty bad. It's all the
So
like
is that bad? Once you have them,
sap-sucking-
they're bad.
Yeah.
Yeah, these are all
The most
phloems.
damaging, I would
Yeah,
say,
the most
yeah.
you don't really see mites. You won't see spider mites because they like it dry and generally.
Yeah.
You have a Phalaenopsis inside, it's going to be the same as your plumeria that's going to be covered in, but they just don't like it. I think probably the leaf is too thick.
I think that like waxy
them.
cuticle is
Yeah.
what does it for them.
So you're going to get the phloem suckers, aphids, not super common, and we do have some, but
They tend
aphids,
to, aphids tend to attack the flower,
yes,
flowers and the inflorescences,
Yes,
and
yeah.
not the leaves themselves.
because thinner stuff.
Mhm.
And mealybugs, everyone's favorite, but then scale,
Yeah,
because that one's really hard, and that's like that. Is it truly the armored?
I think it's called like Boisduval scale,
Okay,
that armored
yeah.
scale that is just once you get it, it's almost impossible to get rid of.
It looks like mealybug though. It doesn't look. It looks more like a mealybug because it's a white coating on it. So most people, I think, might even think
just
they
idea
think it's,
as some weird mealybug.
yeah.
The issue with them is that armor is pretty much impenetrable to most topical insecticides.
Mhm.
The only way to really get rid of them is to use systemics.
Yeah.
So like even if you like take a lot of people like to take a Q-tip and dab some like isopropanol on them, and that even really doesn't work. You gotta make
Okay.
the entire plant poisonous.
Okay.
So-
I eradicated a decent amount with lots of rubbing alcohol. I might have killed some plants, but they were on the verge of dying anyways. Okay. And I didn't do the dabbing. I did the full on spraying.
I guess if you just dump copious
Yeah,
amounts of
exactly.
it on, that's one thing.
Yeah. And because it's a scale, and once, like you said, it gets that hard coating on, and they hide everywhere. And you may not even notice them until you notice discoloration, because they're on the underside of leaves, and you
Mhm.
won't see a single one above the leaf, and you'll see maybe a yellow blotch.
If you
and
glance
you'll
at your
think,
plant, they're like, "Oh, that's fine,"
That's
and then you
fine.
start seeing random spots
Yep.
appearing, and you flip the leaf over, and it's just
covered. It's almost sickeningly fascinating when you get a cold cover. Then I take my finger and I scrape it all off. Sorry. And then it's alive because when you turn it over, it's yellow. It's like this nice yellow color.
Stupid little legs kicking.
Like, put me back. Okay, so when you're talking about systemics, that's something that you pour in and the plant takes it. And like you said, you make the whole entire plant poisonous.
It makes the tissues of the plant poisonous to the insects.
And we're talking about systemics because, obviously every time I talk about outside organic gardening, you don't want to use systemics because you have so many pollinators. But when people are growing things as a collection inside a greenhouse, they're serious about their collection.
Right.
And, as a grower, you can down in, a greenhouse, or if you have a collection of rare, expensive, or just, your collection, if it's in a greenhouse and you don't have the bees and you don't have the pollinators and you don't have beneficials, yeah, you could use systemics and you do it smartly and follow, because that's sometimes the only way to get rid of.
There's certain pests where systemics are the only way to do it. Like, they're just that. And you don't see them. They're kind of hiding, but like I said, under the leaves, or kind of in between aerial roots and like in the folds of
in the sheath, the old leaf sheaths too.
They're really tricky.
Yeah, you pull an old leaf sheath down. You're like, oh, there you are. I thought I got rid of it. They're like, oh no, put that back.
So yeah, I think insecticides in general and systemics in particular get they're kind of like frowned upon for good reason. Like, if you're indiscriminately spraying insecticides and murdering bee colonies, that's an issue. But if you use them correctly and you use them appropriately, they're an invaluable tool for dealing with some of these harder to deal with pests.
Yeah, and we use, very mild systemics at the conservatory, but ours are very targeted because we have the beneficial insects inside. So I don't use like the ones that, like the safari and the midichloroprids, because I don't want to kill everything. But if you only have like one pest in your greenhouse, you could, use that. But that's a little tricky, because when you're pouring it into, one, they have really thick leaves, so it's hard to uptake, right? They don't do great foliar uptake. I imagine you want to get it on their roots, but they don't have soil to really hold it in there. So what do you do? Do you do a soil drench and hope it just sort of gets on the roots?
I usually do a foliar spray.
Okay.
And I just do it repeated. So it takes a couple of applications.
Okay. Yeah.
Over, like 2 months or so.
Okay. But that's what it's going to take anyways, because you have different life stages. You have eggs that aren't eating. And then, and then some of the stuff does last in the plant, but because you're trying to get it uptake in an orchid, that's tough.
It's harder to take up because it's an orchid, and then also, at least the insecticides I use, the lifespan in the plant is just like a couple of weeks.
Oh, okay.
So there's some insects whose life cycles are longer than that, and if you spray it once, you'll kill all the adults that are feeding at that time, but then a month later, when those eggs hatch, the plant isn't toxic anymore, and you start all over again.
Okay. So yeah, it really depends on that lifespan of the pesticide.
Right.
So for mealybugs, similar, but probably rubbing alcohol a little bit more for mealybugs.
Yeah, the soft-bodied ones you can get away with rubbing alcohol. And
I'm just really pushing the rubbing alcohol. I should just get stock in it.
It's a great. It's not super toxic as far as like, a pesticide goes.
Yeah.
It's easy just to get a bottle of rubbing alcohol from Walgreens, put it on a Q-tip, and then dab.
Oh, we're doing the Q-tip dab method. Oh, okay. I gotta say, once again, I just spray it.
I like to be a bit
wonder
more
why our
targeted.
orchids look like crap at work until you came along.
If you dump like peroxide or isopropanol onto a new nice growing meristem, you can have problems.
Okay. So here we go. The hydrogen peroxide versus rubbing alcohol. I don't know anything about the difference. I think we were talking about it the other day and I can't remember.
I use hydrogen peroxide for fungal problems, and I use isopropanol for
pests.
Insect pests.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good to know. Do orchids have a lot of like fungal as far as rot of roots?
There are issues with fungus. I wouldn't say it's super common, but it does happen, and it that comes down to more of a cultural thing. So if your cultural habits aren't ideal, you'll get fungus. So if you have poor air circulation or not enough light, that's just a breeding ground for fungus. If you have ideal cultural situations, you probably won't run into fungus, or it will be in small enough amounts where it's manageable.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, because you don't really see. I mean, you get a little bit of leaf spot on them,
Hmm.
but that's usually if you're in a high humidity area. You
Right.
won't usually see them. Um, so if people want to try growing slightly different, do they need greenhouse conditions, or what if they bought a humidifier and like a nice LED light? Is that still not going to because it's the temperatures and
LED lights are amazing, and
Mhm.
you can grow things indoors that you just weren't able to in the past. The nice thing about LEDs is that they don't produce a lot of heat. They don't produce nearly as much heat as fluorescence
Mhm.
or the old incandescents or the halogens. So you can buy a little terrarium, put a bunch of little tiny pleurothalids in it, put an LED
Pleurothalids.
light on it, and
Uh-huh.
then not worry about cooking them, which is
Okay.
nice.
Because they like it cooler.
Right.
Okay. But they could grow inside as long as you're not blasting the air or the heat because they're cooler
Yeah.
season.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
then the inside a terrarium, it's going to increase the
The
humidity.
humidity.
So would you ever put a humidifier by orchids, or is that just sort of not really going to create that environment that they need?
You can do it for some. Like in the conservatory, we have a humidifier.
That's a big, yeah.
Yeah, next to all of our kind of cool
Mhm.
growing pleurothalids. It's not really necessary for like a Phalaenopsis. They have that waxy cuticle, so they're not as
Yeah.
concerned about high humidity as
Mhm.
some other orchids can be. Usually the humidifier in most circumstances would do more harm than
Okay.
good. It's
Yeah.
just you're asking for a fungal
Yeah.
infection.
Yeah. No, I'm just trying to think, people like, okay, I could grow Phalaenopsis. I could grow the Paphiopedilums. But now I want to, oh, look at there's LEDs and there's humidifiers. That's all this plant needs. It just grows in a higher humidity
Hmm.
and I don't run my heater, so it's cooler and I get this light. So I'm going to try this really expensive one here, but it's not quite
It's
as easy because it's not ambient. It's in
right.
these pockets of
You
humidity.
get very small
Mhm.
microclimates. I wouldn't say it's impossible,
Okay.
but I wouldn't attempt that if you've only grown one Phalaenopsis, and I wouldn't go from a Phalaenopsis to a Dracula or to like a Malsdivalia.
Uh-huh.
That's a bit of a jump as
Yeah.
far as like the skill cap goes.
Yeah.
So
So the Dracula orchids, they need to be. I just have to mention them because they have the coolest name.
yeah, I love them.
I mean, one's called Dracula Bella.
Yeah,
I mean, that is probably the coolest plant name.
and if you're familiar with the monkey flowered
Mhm.
orchids, I mean, some of them, the flowers genuinely look like a monkey face.
Even though they're named Dracula,
Yeah.
the flowers look like monkeys. That's just.
I actually don't know where the genus name comes
I
from.
have no idea. I don't know. Dracula he named him after him.
That's a
so,
cool.
okay. Yeah. So yeah, they have the flowers that hang down, and they need cooler growing.
Yeah. So their cloud forest never gets warmer than like 70 some degrees. Never gets cooler than like 45 or 50.
Sounds like Santa Barbara.
Yeah. Actually, there was a couple of species that I could grow outside.
So I was wondering.
It got a little bit too warm in the summer for a lot of
Mhm.
them, but some of them come from a slightly lower elevation, and you can get away with them.
Could you grow majority of the orchids out? I mean,
Yeah,
a
so
decent amount, right?
the nursery that I worked at specialized in outdoor growing orchids for that area,
Oh.
and they had, I mean, thousands of them. And then I managed the heated greenhouses, so there was a bunch that it wasn't the majority, but there were
Mhm.
several that needed that higher temperature in the winter. It got a bit too like Santa Barbara every once in a while gets into the like high 30s.
Yeah,
And
and
that
that's
does
too-
in some of the tropicals.
Yeah. But people can't grow their Phalaenopsis outside in the winter here.
No.
Like I tried it in the summer on some shade. I don't recommend it. I think I just moved it, but
I think it's possible if you
Mhm.
protect it. Here in Davis, it gets pretty hot,
Mhm.
and hot
is the
will
killer. Yeah.
do them in just as much as
Yeah.
the cold will.
Yeah. I have a friend in Sacramento, and he is in definitely a microclimate in Sacramento within a he's in a neighborhood. And so he's got houses around, so it stays warmer, and he has some big trees, and he definitely has epiphytes growing on his trees.
Mhm.
And then he has superb water because it's Sacramento water, and then he has misters. So he mists them. Even though I
Okay.
don't talk about misting isn't necessary on your Phalaenopsis inside. When
No.
people love to mist their plants, and I'm like, it's almost like spraying yourself on a 120-degree day. It's going to evaporate.
It evaporates very quickly.
and it's done nothing.
Yeah. And also, I mean, if it's hot, that's one thing. But if you're misting it just for the sake of misting it whenever, that's how you get fungal infections.
Yeah,
Yeah.
just standing water or too much water in there. So anything else that we're missing about major grow points or orchids that we should get in the conservatory? What's the collection? What are we going to buy? What are we buying?
So one thing I want to mention about Phalaenopsis,
Oh, okay,
people
yes.
always ask me how I get them to rebloom.
Okay,
Like, how do
yes.
you get your
Uh-huh,
Phalaenopsis to rebloom? So you buy it, it's blooming, it lasts for a while, and the flowers fall off, and you're like, now what? So it's all temperature cues. That's the big secret.
Okay, all
They
right. I was
want-
thinking light, so I guess temperature.
Yeah.
Okay,
They
all right.
want a So I guess the old held convention was that it was a nighttime drop in temperature.
Got it.
But I was reading some papers recently, and it seems like a daytime drop in temperature is what
Daytime.
actually does it. So if you're growing your Phalaenopsis in its usual spot, find a spot in your house that's a little bit cooler, like 10 degrees cooler. So put it in a garage or in a room that doesn't have as many windows and just
Okay.
stays a bit cooler. And do that for 2 to 3 weeks, and that should
When it's done blooming, like right when it's done blooming.
give it a bit of a rest.
Okay.
Yeah.
All
don't
right.
want, I mean, you could, and
But you're done
theoretically-
blooming. Get in
yeah,
there.
Get back into it. So
Okay, so give it a rest.
Give it a rest. They typically, most of the natural growing species bloom in the winter.
Got it.
So
We're talking about crazy
yeah,
hybrids, though. Here.
fall, winter is a good time, and that's when it's
Okay.
starting to cool down anyway.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a natural time to you'll have a cooler spot in your house.
So you keep it in there for 2 to 3.
2 to 3 weeks, and
Okay.
then you put it back into its usual spot, and then you
Then
should
it
start
should.
seeing
Oh,
a flower spike come up.
okay.
Yeah.
All right. That's really good to know because I thought I guess where it's they're native too, there is enough of a cool spike. I mean,
Mhm.
because that's what I always tell like as growers, you always try to mimic the conditions of where a plant's growing.
Right.
But I always think of them growing sort of along the equator where I guess there is some slight.
Yeah, so
Temp-
most Phalaenopsis are native to kind of Southeast Asia, so like Thailand.
Okay.
I think the center of diversity is the Philippines.
Got it.
But
Okay.
Don't quote me on that.
I won't
But
quote. You heard it here, everyone. Just kidding.
But yeah, there's definitely a bit of temperature deviation. It's not a
Yeah.
lot.
That's not a lot. I mean, that really isn't
a couple
lot.
of degrees. Yeah, like 5 to 10 degrees is
Okay.
enough to
Yeah.
get them to do that.
Where a lot of other plants, it's day length.
daily. Yeah,
But this is temperature.
Yeah.
So that's okay. That's completely easy for most people to do. Just, if you have a
'Cause
room that
they're closer to the equator, so
Yes,
that the
that's-
light swings aren't quite as.
that's what I was
drastic.
thinking. That's
Yeah.
why. And I didn't even think and that's weird because I always think things along the equator don't have triggers like that. That's why you could have perpetual flowers.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And you just have this constant growth because they don't have those differing seasons. But I guess there are obviously moving the gradients along and 10 degrees isn't huge, but I guess it's enough to
Mhm.
trigger it. So and that's very doable inside.
Yeah.
So, just from room to room. I mean, if you close heater vent. you
Yeah,
could
close
get-
a heater vent in
Yeah.
a bathroom or something.
Yeah,
right?
something like
Yeah.
that. So you still want light?
You still want light.
You still want light.
Keep all the
Okay.
other parameters.
Okay.
If you are really desperate to get your orchid to your Phalaenopsis to bloom, you could put it in a
Oh,
garage.
people are.
Yeah.
People are. You know that.
You could put it in a garage, and it's not going to be the end of the world if it doesn't get a lot of light for. I mean,
Okay.
they're low light
Yeah,
plants
yeah,
to begin
yeah.
with, so
Yeah.
if you have it in a dark garage for 2 weeks,
Yeah.
it's not
Yeah.
gonna kill it.
Yeah.
So,
But I want to put it in the garage in the winter. That's too cold.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's
be
goes-
mindful about it because you
Yes.
can definitely overdo it,
Yes.
and then the plant just dies because it got too
Yeah.
cold.
Yeah. Sometimes people really just want to be told, don't put it. But I chilled my bulbs. I put them in the freezer. And I'm not making fun of people. I'm like that too with like so many other things, that I have no clue about. Someone tells me, I'm like, okay, I do this.
Yeah.
And then it's like, an expert's telling you and they're just assuming that that's the assumption again. So, I do it with so many other things like cooking. Oh, you got to, but you told me I got to do this.
Oh,
well, no, you're supposed to do that. I'm like, I don't know.
I'm the worst chef in the world. I mean, I just follow whatever the internet machine tells me to do, and I like It caught on
And mine-
fire. Like, I don't know what
Mine
happened.
still
I
comes out
followed it.
horrible and wrong. So I'm like, I don't know. That person must have missed a step writing the recipe. It wasn't me.
I grow the food. I don't cook it.
I know
Yeah.
exactly. That's what I tell people, and they're like, "Oh, what do you make with it?" I'm like, "Stir fry. Everything's a stir fry. Just stir fries are good. Yeah, at least mine are good." So anyway, so one more question: what are we going to get for the conservatory? Is there a wish list?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Pleurophthalus?
Lots of pleurophthalus.
You got to show me some amazing
Okay.
pleurophthalus.
I brought in a couple that are pretty awesome
Okay.
for my old personal collection.
Okay.
I want to get a lot more angraecoids just because I'm kind of partial to them.
All right, now we got to represent Darwin.
Yeah.
Yep.
There's a lot of path species that I would like
I
to
would
get
love
my
that.
hands on.
I would like
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
And there's a lot of species Phalaenopsis that are really interesting. Phalaenopsis lindenii is this kind of miniature species that gets big branching inflorescence
Okay.
with little dainty
Dainty flowers. I could do
pink
that.
flowers. Phalaenopsis shirleyana has this really amazing kind of spotted foliage. It's kind of
Oh, that's different.
it kind of shimmers. It's like a
Ooh.
silvery.
Must be further down the canopy. I don't know.
I think so.
Something like
yeah.
that. Something with shimmery. It's got to do some light reflection or
Mhm.
something.
And then the flowers can be fragrant. It's
Oh,
one of the
that's
fragrant
important.
Phalaenopsis,
Yeah.
which is really
Mhm.
nice. So yeah,
I
those are two that are
Yeah. I
species
mean,
that
I would like to get more bulbophyllums.
Yeah.
There is a great grower in Sacramento who just his greenhouse is amazing. We should actually all go there on a field trip. The bulbophyllum flowers are phenomenal. They all are not all, but a lot of them look like the color of the corpse plant because they're pollinated by flies.
Yeah.
Not all of them. I loved they have the little some of them have a little seesaw.
Oh, the
And
little
then
labellum that bounces up and
Yeah,
down.
and I've
Yeah.
actually seen a fly on one of them fall, triggered the seesaw.
I've never
and
seen
go.
that. That's
It was
amazing.
amazing.
That's really cool.
Yeah. So okay, so we'll have to go shopping.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm not opposed to going.
Where
and buying more
would you source a
plants.
lot of your orchids from?
I would get most of mine from my work just because they were there. And
Okay.
it's a really dangerous place to work because they hand you your paycheck and,
And
you're
you're
like, well,
like,
I want this and
yeah.
I want that and
Yeah.
I need that
And they
one
sell
again.
retail?
Retail, yeah.
Okay. And what was it again?
Santa Barbara Orchid Estate.
Okay.
So that's down in Santa Barbara. It's
And
right
are
next
the ones
to-
you're mentioning, do they have for sale or
Yeah.
okay.
So like they specialize in outdoor growing orchids for kind of coastal
Yeah.
California. So they have lots of cymbidiums,
Got-
lots of Lely anceps and Lely
Okay.
anceps hybrids, and lots of those big gaudy cattleyas you love so much.
Love it.
And then they did have some paths and some pleurophthalids, and then Cal Orchid, which is right across the
Okay.
street, has more of the same.
Okay.
And then Andy's Orchids
Yes.
down in Ensenada. Or
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, when we go to the orchid show, Andy's Orchids always because at the conservatory we really try to have species, and he
Mhm.
specializes.
He's a
in
species specialist,
Yeah,
which is
so-
I'm a species purist too, so I would always talk to him at the big
No,
Santa Barbara Orchid
yeah.
show.
I mean, yeah, they're amazing species. I'm just gonna say that. But then when you really want just a pow in your face, like, wow, that's obnoxious flower. I mean,
And there's something to be said about that hybrid vigor too. Just being able to
Mhm.
put a plant in a window and have it grow is
Yeah.
nice. Where you could take the two species that parent were the parents of that plant and put them in the same conditions and they would die. Just yeah.
takes two. Takes two sometimes. So okay, we'll definitely get your list. Go shopping. You'll just start bringing stuff back. And when it blooms, I'll take pictures and
Yeah.
pretend it like I grew it.
Look at
I'm like,
this.
look at we grew.
I'm looking forward to going through the orchid collection and getting
Throwing some things out.
I've already thrown a couple of things out.
Yeah. I will
and-
say what happens is we start dividing with the intention, oh, this one will sell. We never sell it. We lose a tag. And when our tags get lost, it's really hard. And then when they get neglected or an outbreak, or not repotted for a while.
There's a couple
so-
plants in there that probably have been repotted in a good, I don't know, 10 years or so.
Probably, yeah. Yeah.
Not ideal.
You have at it. You know what? You work overtime. You get it done. We won't even let you near the carnivores until the orchids are all done.
It's been hard because there's a bunch of carnivores that I've been working with, and I see the orchids, and I'm like, oh, I'll get to you guys.
yeah, that poor orchids.
In my defense, there's been an orchid bark shortage, so
They're actually-
we just recently got a bit of
Yes.
bark. So I started repotting some of them.
So the sphagnum and
Yeah, sphagnum and orchiata.
yeah, it's bad. It's like
Yeah.
really like we were stopped. In
Mhm.
your defense, you were stopped from transplanting because
Yeah.
we couldn't get that. And now is it opened back?
Sphagnum is becoming a bit more available. I think orchiata is still hard to find. You can
Mhm.
find some of the lower quality
Yeah,
orchid barks, which
I know.
I'm not super keen on because I'm just gonna have to repot them again in a year.
Mhm.
So
And this just made me think again. So, we're using you wouldn't recommend coconut coir for it just doesn't hold enough moisture, right?
yeah,
Okay.
and you can run into issues with salinity.
Got
Like
it.
there's
Okay.
just salt buildup in
Got
it
it.
just from where it was harvested,
Okay.
and
Okay.
it can work for some things,
Yeah.
but in general, I would avoid it.
So orchid bark for
Orchid,
starting out is the way to
yeah.
go. High quality. If you can't find high quality, low quality,
Low quality, but repot more
repot
often.
more often.
I think
as soon as it starts breaking down.
the tree species that it came from is important. So
Mm.
orchiata and some of the other higher quality, denser
Uh-huh.
barks is Pinus radiata,
Got it. Okay.
and
It's really firm.
yeah,
So it's not breaking down. I mean, it's
Mhm.
almost like, wow, is this ceramic or
yeah,
is this wood?
yeah. I mean, you can keep it perpetually wet, and it lasts for 5 or 6 years before it starts to think about falling apart.
Mm-hmm.
And then some other brands are Douglas fir barks, which are good. They're acceptable.
Yeah.
They're not as dense as
Yeah.
the Pinus radiata, so it's gonna decompose a little bit faster.
Okay.
But it's still good.
And you've never seen, I mean, I'm just going to throw this out there. Eucalyptus bark, does that have too many like weird
I'd
oils
imagine
in
there's
it?
all kinds of weird
That's what I'm
volatiles that are
wondering.
gonna mess with things.
That's
I've
what I'm
never.
wondering.
I imagine that there's some strange Australian orchid that probably grows on a eucalyptus
Yeah.
just because there's orchids everywhere.
But I'm just thinking
and-
pine. You have some weird, crazy resins
that's
in
true,
pine
yeah.
as well. So I'm like, eucalyptus is, pretty weedy tree.
I would say nothing is impossible, but I
Yeah.
can't. Think
Let's
of
start
anything.
that. Let's just start eucalyptus bark. It'll make us millions.
Just try, yeah.
All right. We'll wrap it up. Do you have a Instagram that you want to share?
Yeah, it's SHAWN_SHUMAKER.
Yeah, so it's Shawn with a AWN and a shoe maker with an SHU. Have to be so difficult.
Yeah, my name
Shawn
is
Shumaker.
fancy.
Yeah, so fancy.
I used to post stuff from my personal collection, but when I moved up to Davis, I parted with most of it. So now I just
Oh,
post pictures of things that I'm working on in the conservatory.
yeah.
which-
Not all carnivores. I mean, you were
No.
a little carnivore heavy.
They're a little carnivore heavy, a little Nepenthes heavy.
Yeah. You have a
but-
Aristolochia the other day,
Yeah.
so going out.
Yeah,
you
yeah.
know.
So random. I do like succulents, and I do
Mhm.
like orchids, obviously. So just whatever I see,
Whatever,
that strikes me, I'm like, oh, that's
Yeah.
cool. I write a little blurb, try to
Educate.
educate a little
Yeah.
bit. So
Yeah. So good. Yeah. So follow them. And until next time, everyone, happy gardening.